It would be absurd to say that Congress may do what they please. That was James Madison obliterating the modern lie that the General Welfare Clause in the Constitution is some kind of a blank check that gives the federal government almost unlimited power. So on this episode, you're going to learn the original meaning of the clause as understood when the Constitution was ratified. Plus, I've got a bunch of powerful warnings from both Madison and Thomas Jefferson on what would happen if we ignored that original meaning. And spoiler alert, they weren't just right, they were prophetic. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. Let's kick it off here with the text of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the so-called General Welfare Clause. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. And as Rob Nadelson notes, the General Welfare Clause is one of the two principal constitutional pillars supporting the modern federal welfare state, the other being the other twisted one, Commerce Clause. Of course, we have supremacy and necessary and proper too, but we'll cover those in other episodes. And Rob continued, he said, the General Welfare Clause is said to include an implied spending power, which is used to justify federal spending programs and regulatory conditions attached to them. For that reason, the General Welfare Clause is sometimes called the Spending Clause. But unlike almost every single expert on how they explain the General Welfare Clause today, it was actually meant to strictly limit federal power. And when you understand what they were doing, it makes more sense. And Nadelson takes it even further. He said the General Welfare Clause is more than a mere non-grant of spending power. It was intended to be a sweeping denial of power. Specifically, it was intended to impose on Congress a standard of impartiality borrowed from the law of trusts, thereby limiting the legislature's capacity to play favorites with federal tax money. This was something that people were pretty concerned about. And that original understanding of that clause as a denial of power and not a blank check is exactly what James Madison said. He said, with respect to the two words general welfare, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of powers connected with them. So in other words, it was a direct limitation on what they could tax for the powers delegated in the Constitution, the enumerated powers, and nothing more. And Madison warned, to take them in a literal and unlimited sense, those words general welfare, he said, would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators. So if you treat the General Welfare Clause as a blank check, which is what they do today, Madison says you've mutated the Constitution into something the founders never approved. Now here's Thomas Jefferson. Our tenet ever was that Congress had not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but were restrained to those specifically enumerated. And here Jefferson also specifically refers to the clause as a limit, a restraint on federal power connected directly to the enumerated powers. And he continued with this. He said, as it was never meant they should provide for that welfare, but by the exercise of the enumerated powers, so it could not have been meant they should raise money for purposes which the enumeration did not place under their action. Consequently, he wrote, that the specification of powers is a limitation of the purposes for which they may raise money. Again, a limit on federal power, not a grant of a bunch of extra power, not even, as Nadelson put it earlier, a mere non-grant, a specific hard limit. And these weren't later inventions by Jefferson and Madison writing in the 1800s. They weren't just political reactions to what was going on at the time. Madison also made the exact same case during the ratification debates. Here he is writing in Federalist Paper number 41. He said, "It has been urged and echoed that the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, amounts to an unlimited commission to exercise every power which may be alleged to be necessary for the common defense or general welfare." He said, this is just nonsensical. Anyone who's reading it like this, you're really just going off the deep end. He said, no stronger proof could be given of the distress under which these writers labor for objections than their stooping to such a misconstruction. And he explained here that if there were no enumerated powers, the fact that the General Welfare Clause starts out Article 1, Section 8, and then there's a bunch of enumerated powers to explain. He said if there weren't the enumerated powers, then maybe you could make the case that, yeah, it was going to lead to all kinds of unlimited power. He said, had no other enumeration or definition of the powers of Congress been found in the Constitution, then the general expressions just cited, the authors of the objection might have had some color for it. But he still said, even without the enumerated powers that followed the General Welfare Clause, this would be a really weird way to give them unlimited power. Of course, the founding generation was very familiar with the Declaratory Act, kind of the foundation of all the problems they faced with the British. This was a claim in 1766 of unlimited power in all cases whatsoever. They knew what it took to put a law in place that claimed unlimited legislative power. So here he is in Federalist 41, noting that this would be a weird way to do it, this General Welfare Clause. He said, though, it would have been difficult to find a reason for so awkward a form of describing an authority to legislate in all possible cases. And he continued, this is all again from Federalist number 41. He continued explaining that the general phrase, this Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, is immediately followed by a list of specific powers. It's all part of the same sentence. There's not even a period that separates them. He's literally talking about the grammar and the punctuation here. But what color, he said, can the objection have when a specification of the objects alluded to by these general terms immediately follows and is not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon? And that's how it is in the text. He said, for what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted if these and all other powers were meant to be included in the preceding general power? I mean, it's just nonsensical. This was a standard legal formula, drafting text at the time, and it was understood that it was supposed to be like that. You start with a general phrase, and then you explain that general phrase with particulars or a list. And general welfare was not a separate power on its own. Its meaning is explained and defined and limited by the enumerated powers that follow. And Madison said, nothing is more natural nor common than first to use a general phrase and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars. And just a few years later in 1791, Thomas Jefferson, in his opinion rejecting the constitutionality of Alexander Hamilton's First National Bank, well, he made the same argument. The General Welfare Clause was meant to tie down federal power. Here's how he put it. It was intended to lace them up straightly within the enumerated powers, and those without which, as means, these powers could not be carried into effect. Now, I know I'm citing a bunch of original source documents, plus Rob Nadelson's great law review paper on the original understanding of the clause. These will all be linked to in the show notes section of a blog post that we'll be publishing shortly on this. Alan Mosley gets that organized. That way you can read and learn more in context on your own time. So you'll see all the different platforms that we're on, both video and audio. Then the show links section which is generally put those links, he'll generally have those links in order that I cover them in the episode. Again, I'm just scratching the surface. I will get that published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty a couple of hours after this live stream is done. But let's get back to this. This phrase, common defense and general welfare, these terms, they weren't invented at the Philadelphia Convention by the framers or the Federalists in the summer of 1787. They were actually taken right from the Articles of Confederation. And back to Federalist 41, James Madison explained, well, yeah, we should all know this. And because of that, we should all understand what it means. He said the language used by the convention is a copy from the Articles of Confederation. The objects of the Union among the states as described in Article 3rd, he's citing the Articles, are their common defense, security of their liberties, and mutual and general welfare. The terms of Article 8 are still more identical. All charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense or general welfare and allowed by the United States and Congress shall be defrayed out of a common treasury. And Madison reiterated the same point in a speech as Representative Madison in the House of Representatives. This is in 1792. He said, it is to be recollected that the terms common defense and general welfare as here used are not novel terms first introduced into this Constitution. They are terms familiar in their construction and well known to the people of America. And anyone who is just ignorant of that is kind of giving the politicians a free pass to do what politicians do, expand their power. Madison continued. He said, they are repeatedly found in the old Articles of Confederation, where although they are susceptible of as great latitude as can be given them by the context here, it was never supposed or pretended that they conveyed any such powers as is now assigned to them. I mean, I guess there is a warning there as well. Madison was making the case that, well, this is the same text we used previously, and everyone understood them, and no one was using them in a way that you're trying to explain it now. And he said, yeah, they're susceptible to be read broadly, but I think his assumption was in error, that people in the future wouldn't do the same thing, and especially so many people from the founding generation right there in the first Congress. He said, on the contrary, it was always considered as clear and certain that the old Congress was limited to the enumerated powers, and that the enumeration limited and explained the general terms. Now, both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison repeatedly warned what would happen if a broad reading of the General Welfare Clause was allowed to stand, become the standard, become part of the system, basically the one that we have today. Jefferson explained it like this. He said, they are not to do anything they please to provide for the general welfare, but only to lay taxes for that purpose. To continue the latter phrase, not as describing the purpose of the first, but as giving a distinct and independent power to do any act they please, which might be for the good of the Union, would render all the preceding and subsequent enumerations of power completely useless. He made the same case that Madison did a few years earlier. Like, look, if this was a power that the way that they described it, the Hamiltonians and the people of today, that gives them all kinds of power to do basically anything and everything, what was the point of the rest of the Constitution? All you needed was a general welfare clause. Just give them that, and you're all set and ready to roll. And that really is the danger. If the general welfare clause becomes its own power, or it has become its own power in many ways today, then nothing else in the Constitution even matters. He said it would reduce the whole instrument to a single phrase, that of instituting a Congress with power to do whatever would be for the good of the U.S., and as they would be the sole judges of the good or evil, it would also be a power to do whatever evil they pleased. Again, as they would be the sole judges of the good or evil, it would be also a power to do whatever evil they pleased. And Madison warned back to his speech in the House of Representatives. This is February of 1792. Of course, it'll be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. He warned that this would destroy all limits on federal power. He said, in fact, the meaning of the general terms in question must either be sought in the subsequent enumerations which limits and details them, or they convert the government from one limited as hitherto supposed to the enumerated powers into a government without any limits at all. Madison didn't stop there. He actually went further, laying out exactly what Congress would have the power to do, basically predicting what we live under today. He said if Congress can apply money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take the care of religion into their own hands. They may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? But wait, that's not it. There's still more. He said they may assume the provision for the poor. They may undertake the regulation of all roads other than just post roads. In short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would be thrown under the power of Congress. Again, just calling out what we have today, primarily due to both the general welfare and the Commerce Clause, plus necessary and proper and supremacy. He said, for every object I have mentioned would admit the application of money and might be called, if Congress pleased, provisions for the general welfare. And that was Madison basically describing what we live under today in modern times and have lived under for a long, long time. And in a letter to Edmund Pendleton, also in 1792, he said that this would basically give us a federal government with unlimited power. He said if Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular expressions. And in a speech on February 2nd, 1791, denouncing Alexander Hamilton's National Bank, James Madison gave us one of his most direct warnings. He said reading the clause broadly, the General Welfare Clause, would give to Congress an unlimited power. It would render nugatory the enumeration of particular powers, and it would supersede all the powers reserved to the state governments. Translation: doing this destroys the entire structure, the entire foundation of the Constitution. Both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson warned us, treating the General Welfare Clause as some kind of a blank check, a power to do pretty much anything and everything, would turn the system of the Constitution from one of limited and delegated powers into one of almost unlimited power. As Jefferson put it, it would give them the power to do whatever evil they pleased. They warned us. We ignored them for decades and decades, and as a result, the former land of the free is now home to the largest government in history. If you're anything like me, you never learned any of this in government-run or government-approved schools as you were growing up. I never learned a single thing about any of this. All I ever get is, well, the Supreme Court said blank, and so therefore they can do whatever. And so that's a big part of the reason why we work so hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles, about the original legal meaning of the Constitution, and how to defend it when government refuses to do so, which is, well, 24/7, 365, and has been for a long, long time. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. For as little as $2 a month, you can join us. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. We punch way above our weight class here at the TAC. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And if you don't want to be a member, that's cool. But if you still want to help us out financially, you can definitely do that. I'm very grateful for that. Or if you are a member, that's even more awesome. Super grateful. And you want to help us out a little bit more, you can do that. I want to make sure you had the link for that. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I won't belabor that point. I should make a quick programming note. I'm not going to have episodes on Friday or Monday. Very, very important birthday coming up. Not mine. That's in December. So I'm going to be off on Friday and I won't have time to catch up for Monday show. So I'll have another show next week, Wednesday and Friday. But I really do appreciate you spending some of your time with me here today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made it at least a little interesting talking about some of this really important stuff. But more important than anything, I hope it made you think. And I hope you'll learn something. Again, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have an awesome rest of your week, an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.